This unit deals with what I like to call baby statistics. The first thing we have to do before we can get into the actual doing of any statistics is vocabulary. So you have a vocabulary sheet, and then you have a vocabulary practice. I'm going to go through the definitions of these, pointing out which ones are more important than others, the ones you can expect to see again. And then I would like it if you would do the practice sheet and check your answers. Make sure you let me know if there's any of those that you don't understand, why they are something or not something else. Because this is pretty much, other than the review for the test, the only practice you'll get on the vocabulary. So if we start at the top and we just get some basics out of the way, the first word, statistics, is not what I would call a big deal. The first time we use the word is just basically to summarize what we're going to do in this unit, and we're going to talk about collecting data, what we do when we organize it, and then how we interpret what it tells us. The words that start telling us what we're going to do, we've got population and we've got sample. Those two words deal with what kind of data you actually collect. So a set of data is called a population if everyone who you wish to study is included in that data set. If the data set only contains some of the people that you're interested in, then that data set is called a sample. Usually we collect data to come up with some kind of number. Usually we talk about an average. That's something most people would be familiar with. So when we have a population set of data, the average, for example, that we could compute from that kind of data would be called a parameter. A parameter is a number that's computed from a population. It has a special name because if you compute a number and you call it a parameter, what that means is that number is dead on accurate. There is no room for error. If your data set is a statistic, what that means, or if your data set is a sample, that means you can compute that same average, but we would call it a statistic. Statistic means that since you computed a number from only part of the population that you're interested in, that statistic is computed on incomplete information. The incomplete information is going to give us a good idea of what, say, the average should be, but there is definitely going to be some error in our computation because, again, we have computed only part of the numbers, not all of the numbers. So the words parameter and statistic, they're used to tell you how much faith you should have in a computation. A parameter is dead on accurate. A statistic, hopefully, it's accurate enough to give you a ballpark idea of what's going on, but it won't be 100% accurate. Descriptive statistics and inferential statistics, those are baby words. In other words, we're not going to really worry too much about those for a test. Descriptive statistics, they describe the sample only. That's where you get a sample and you might make a chart or a graph or something like that, but that's as far as it goes. You're not trying to describe anything except the data that you collected. If you have inferential statistics, that's when you choose a really good sample so that hopefully it represents the population that it came from. So when you compute things about the sample, it's also going to tell you things about the population. A representative sample is a sample that does exactly what I just mentioned. A representative sample represents the population as a whole. And the only way that we can make sure that happens is to be very careful on how we collect our sample. Ooh, that's enough to make you sick, isn't it? Sampling methods. There's 5 sampling methods, and these are important, so you want to pay close attention to these 5 sampling methods. A simple random sample. You have the definition. I don't think the definition is very helpful by itself. But for simple random sample, think about the simple part. The simplest way for you to randomize is for you to take, say, a list of names, put them on little pieces of paper, and then put them in a fishbowl and draw them. If you see people drawing tickets, you are pretty convinced that that's a random drawing. So keep that in mind. People aren't going to actually carry around a fishbowl and do it, but if it's possible for you to do that sort of thing, it's probably a simple random sample. Systematic. Systematic, it has some sort of system to it, and the system we use is usually we're looking at things or people who are in a line, and then we pick a number and say, I'm going to search every 5th cooler that comes through trying to go to a Fun Fest concert. I'm going to ask every 3rd woman who comes out of Walmart with shopping bags how long she waited at the checkout. But you pick an interval. I could do it with a conveyor belt, like pulling a TV, every 25th TV off a conveyor belt to plug it in to make sure it works. Convenience sampling is the worst kind of sampling. It has the most bias. Bias is actually on the next page, and what that means is your results are slanted toward having one result or another. And there's 3 ways to get a convenience sample. The first way is exactly what it sounds like. If I sent you out to get data and you asked the people who are convenient, meaning people who are in class with you, or people who work with you, or people who know you on Facebook or Instagram, or on your email list. If you ask the people you know probably leave out large segments of the population. Therefore, the people you know have something in common, and you're leaving out a whole, probably more than one segment of people. So, people you know would give you very biased results. The second kind of convenient sampling is when the people who participate come across the survey or the question and then decide to participate themselves. So like if you come across a survey on a website, those are going to give biased results because the only people who are going to participate in that survey are the people who go to that particular website. And the fact that they're all at that website means they all have something in common. If it's TV, like American Idol, the people who vote on American Idol are the people who are watching American Idol. So they have a particular interest, maybe in one contestant or another. They would definitely get different results from American Idol if, say, they called random people and just said, which one of these do you think is the better singer? So convenient sampling leads to extreme bias, again, when those who answer come across the survey and choose to participate. The last type of convenient sampling isn't really necessarily about it being convenient. Convenient sampling happens when what you're looking at is so rare that you can't pick and choose your data. Usually, if you're talking about something scientific and it's something brand new, like I think I saw on Facebook that they discovered a new frog, which is cool because frogs are cool. But they probably only have so many of them. They probably only found them in one region. Later on they may find them in different places, and they'll probably see that there's differences between them because of, I don't know, the vegetation, the amount of water, how many people are around. But right now, the only data that they can draw on these frogs comes from this little group that they found, which probably already all have something in common. So even though it wasn't necessarily convenient to find these frogs, it is a small data set that is probably going to show some bias later when we have more frogs available to study. Stratified and cluster, both of these involve dividing your population into groups. What you do after you divide them into groups differs. In stratified sampling, we divide a population into groups, and these can be physical groups or they could be just categories. Like we could divide a population into men and women. We could divide Northeast State population into freshmen and sophomores. Once we define what our groups are, we get a sample by choosing members from each group. So if I was saying my groups are going to be men and women because I want to make sure I get answers from both, then if I ask 50 men, I need to ask 50 women. If I want to do freshmen and sophomores, I do the same. If I ask 200 freshmen, I need to ask 200 sophomores. If I know I have twice as many freshmen as I do sophomores, I don't have to have the same number in each. I could ask 200 freshmen and 100 sophomores if I think that that's what the relative population is. But if you're going to do that, you want to make sure, you have a reason to not make those groups equal. When you have a cluster, you do want that actually based on some geographic location, a physical group. Think of a cluster, like a nut cluster. That's a cluster, and we got this candy laying all over the place. Stratified says if I've got these groups, I would take 2 from each group. Cluster says if I have all these different groups defined, whatever they are, they could be different classes, I'm going to randomly choose certain clusters. And everybody who's in the group becomes part of the sample. So cluster, you take the whole group, you just don't take all the groups. So you could do this, think about classes. If we talked about all the classes there are at Northeast State, I don't know how many classes we offer, but let's just pretend it's 500. I have no idea if that's a high or low estimate, but let's pretend it's 500. If you wanted to do cluster samplings of students, one way to do it is to make a list of all the different classes that there are, and then randomly pick like 20 of them. And then you survey everybody who's in those particular classes. That would be a cluster sample. Stratify would be to have all those 500 classes and pick 2 people from each class. Stratified, some from each cluster. You have your groups, and you just take particular groups, everybody in particular groups. Bias, we've already talked about, so we'll just leave that for now. That was a small word. Once we decide to do a study, we have 2 types of studies, an observational study or an experiment. An observational study, you don't do anything to anybody. No poking. The simplest kind of observation is to just ask a question. If I just ask you a question, I want to know the average income for accountants. So if I call up a bunch of accountants and just ask them how much they made, I didn't influence their behavior. I didn't change anything about how I treated them. I just asked them a question. That's an observational study. But sometimes we need to go deeper than that. So sometimes what we need to do is we actually need to compare one group against another to see if one thing is better than something else. That's called a case control study, but it's observational when the people who are participating choose their own behaviors. So if I wanted to do a study on smokers versus non-smokers, I wouldn't pick 50 random people and then again randomly decide you 25 are going to smoke, you 25 are not, and you're going to do it because I said so, not because of what you've already decided to do in your life. That is probably unethical. You don't ask people who aren't smoking to start smoking so you can see what it does to their lungs. Instead, what you do is you get people who already smoke to be part of your study. You get people who already do not smoke to be part of your study. They have self-selected the two different groups, and then you just have their permission to measure certain differences. But they have chosen their behavior. If you want to say that you're studying the effects of smoking on the lungs, then the cases are the people who are smoking, and the controls are the people who do not. In an experiment, instead of case control, you still have a division into two groups, a treatment group and a control group. The difference is the treatment group, you are actually doing something to the people in the treatment group that you're not doing to the control group. And that you are doing something to the treatment group that you're not doing to the control group. And in this cases, you don't pick which group you're in. You get assigned a group, usually randomly, and you may or may not know whether you're getting the experimental treatment or if you're just being treated normal. Down below we have blinding. Blinding means knowing which group you're in or not knowing which group you're in. If you have a single blind study means that if you're one of the participants, you don't know which group you're in. If you're in a double-blind study, well, neither does the person administering the research. Now, the only reason to have blinding is if whatever you're trying to discern is not a straightforward measurement. If things can be a matter of opinion, if things can be interpreted differently, then you want blinding. If I want to know if a particular medicine makes your fever go back to normal faster, that's a measurement. As a researcher, I can't influence that. And as a participant, you probably can't influence that either, unless you can mentally make your temperature go down. That's no reason for blinding. You just sit there and wait, and we measure. But if I just want to know when a cold medicine starts making you feel better, that's a matter of opinion. You might express a different opinion based on whether you got the real treatment or a placebo, a sugar pill, something with no active ingredients. Nobody's going to tell you took a sugar pill. That's kind of defeats the purpose of a sugar pill. But if you knew, it would probably color your responses to how much better you feel. As a researcher, if I know you got a sugar pill and you're just harping on how great you feel, I might ask you different questions because I realize you're a madman, try to point out symptoms you might be ignoring in order to get some responses that would help the study. So whoever's opinion might be changed, they need to be blinded. Now the last two words, when you collect data, it's one of two types, qualitative or quantitative. Basically, data is the answer to a question. If you want to answer a question in words, that's qualitative data. And I don't have to think any harder about that. Are you married? Yes or no? What's your favorite animal? What color are your eyes? What county do you live in? Any of these that have a word answer is automatically qualitative data. The only kind of answer to a question I have to concern myself with is the numbers. The numbers can fall into either category. If a number tells me how much or how many, if it's a measurement or a count, then it's quantitative. Now what I mean by that, there's lots of different measurements or counts. How many kids do you have? You can count them up. What's the temperature outside? That's a measurement. How much do you weigh? That's a measurement. How old are you? I guess that's a count or a measurement, depending on how you look at it. How many letters do you have in your name? That's a count. Quantitative data means it makes sense to do math with the numbers. So any numbers you can imagine being in a word problem that would actually help you work a math word problem, those are going to be quantitative data. Now sometimes you have numbers that aren't really numbers. I mean, they're numbers, but they're not representative of some quantity, like zip codes. If your zip code is bigger than mine, it doesn't mean you have more of something than I do. It doesn't make sense to subtract zip codes. So they're not numbers that are actually measurements or counts or what we usually think of as being numerical quantities. Those are the qualitative again. So numbers that are essentially just labels, jersey numbers. If my number is 8 and your number is 15, you're not twice as good as me. We could just have letters on jerseys, but we don't. We just use numbers. So security numbers, area codes, student ID numbers, all these numbers that don't actually represent a quantity or qualitative. So to kind of sum up, your data is the answer to the question. If the answer to the question is a word, that's qualitative data. If the answer to the question is a number, it can be either. If it's a number that represents a number, a count or a measurement, if it's a number I would do math with, that's quantitative data. If it's a number I would never do math with because it's not really representative of how much or how many, like a zip code or a student ID number, and then it's qualitative.